If you know what an Easter egg is, not the kind that shows up when bunnies hop around, okay? An Easter egg in movie or computer talk is something that's hidden, and when you find it, it gives you deeper meaning. In helping design this particular liturgy for our Thanksgiving worship, there is an Easter egg in the second verse of America the Beautiful, oh, spacious, for spacious skies. And it is in line with hearing the proclamation for Thanksgiving from George Washington. And for me, it's very appropriate that we both have George Washington present with us tonight, as well as this Easter egg hidden in America the Beautiful. George Washington, in setting the tone for what is still the American experiment in constitutional government, made it very, very clear how tenuous it would be. He knew exactly what we were getting into with people looking at him to go with the familiar form of government, being a monarch. And he made it very, very clear that no, a monarch is not what I will be. And he made that abundantly clear when he left office after 8 years. And in his proclamation, he's evocative of what we hear in my Easter egg. God, mend thine every flaw. Now, if you've ever taken a good look at the second verse of the Star-Spangled Banner, there's a verse in there that tells us that we may just not stay around. We are the only country with a national anthem that reminds us of how fragile we are. So when we gather tonight, I start from that premise of remembering how fragile we are and that we need something larger than ourselves to make this work. And George Washington clearly pointed that out to us. And he did it beautifully. There's a tad bit of triumphal language in it, but you just can't help it if it's that old. It sounds that pretty good. And we have a tendency to fall into triumphalism, that God's blessing us better than anybody else. But we know that's a tenuous claim at best if we're really honest with ourselves. So George Washington, again, sets the tone for us as we enter into a night like tonight. And I stand here in my normal spot, in my normal place, with all my kind of normal surroundings, having to be careful not to use my normal imagery. Because it's my colloquial language. It's my shorthand. But really, when you get right down to it, if I'm doing it well, it's the shorthand that says L-O-V-E. So somewhere within that shorthand is L-O-V-E, and we don't want to lose that. Because that's what makes it possible for us to even have a sense of thanksgiving. Now, I'm also troubled by something else. And it's not to do with the language that we have to use. The language is all good because it helps us listen carefully to one another when we say eternal rather than Lord. That's a very important thing to do. But I'm also very aware that when I stand here on a night dedicated to Thanksgiving, and I grew up with all the commonplace pilgrim hats and all the stuff that somebody who looks like me grows up with, I am remembered of Charles Mann's book, 1491. When the people who were here forgot to have a good immigration policy. You know, that's the old joke. But they were filled with kindness and love to those early settlers. They would not see them die. They would help. And that's a troubling thing, but also something to celebrate because of what the travelers who came brought with them. They brought a hubris, an incredible gift and energy, creativity. I mean, all kinds of things, the mishmash of all of what we are. They even brought a sense of the Almighty with them, although perhaps they had kind of an interesting way of expressing it. So I've been looking for an image that would guide me in something that could be common for us tonight. It doesn't really work in black and white, so since it costs a lot of money to print the bulletins in black and white. I cheated, but I thought I'd make you a bookmark. So you have a bookmark. Hopefully it's in your leaflet. And on the back of the bookmark, by the way, are the prayers that we will pray later for social justice and for our nation, where we, guess what, in the spirit of George Washington and the Easter egg, pray for our shortcomings as a nation. Because if we don't do that, we don't need anything greater than ourselves, truly greater than ourselves, to help us. But I found this picture of these hands rooted as a tree, coming up, these hands holding up all of these different colored hands, these multicolored hands. And it just struck me. I said, that's us when we're at our best. When we're at our best, we realize what is holding us together, and it's both us and that greater than ourselves. And while the picture doesn't show it, roots growing deep make it strong. And the way roots grow deep is when, guess what, we admit to thine every flaw, and we realize we need those hands to hold us up, and we need each other. I have something I say in my church on a very regular basis, which I still think would work here tonight. I could actually say it tonight, and the choir's going, my choir knows. We belong to one another. Together with God's help, we can make one another stronger. Now, I could spell God, G-O-D, or like my friend Rabbi Victor Urecki up in Charleston, West Virginia area, I'm not sure where you go, I'd spell it G-D if it was written. Victor is quite the writer. He's more of the conservative movement, but he's an amazing rabbi. It's always good to have a rabbi in your life. They keep you honest, okay? But that's why I gave you this particular picture, maybe to take home, maybe to put on the refrigerator, maybe to tell your families when you gather for Thanksgiving what you think this picture of this tree means to you. Maybe that's a gift that'll keep on going. And I would be remiss if I did not do one more thing. George Washington prepares us for an understanding of what it means to be a fragile experiment. But he also told us we have the gifts and skills to be disciplined to make this work. And I'd like to offer an approach that I think can help us continue to make this work. It's an ancient approach that at first blush comes out of the Christian tradition. But when explored as deeply as I think it can be explored, it transcends, much in the way Virginia's marvelous prayer transcends and welcomes and embraces everybody. So I need to go into lecture mode. I do have my doctor's hood on, all right? So 30 seconds on the lecture mode. I want to tell you about an incredible writer, the late Phyllis Tickle, who is an incredibly spiritual and gifted writer. And one of her last books was called The Great Emergence. And what she postulated in The Great Emergence is that from the time of Jesus, AD for some people, or BCE, whatever, what do you want to do for your scholarship? Okay. She postulated that there's been like 4 epochs. Every 500 years something happens. And the period that we're in right now started about 250 years ago. It's typically like a house cleaning of ideas. You look at the scientific methodology that's come in. Some of the stuff that the world is railing against because they don't like the answers they're getting. It doesn't fit neatly into their box. And also the fact that we have a pluralism. The rich tapestry that tree presents. All right? So she calls it the Great Emergence. Something is happening. And when something is happening, something gets pushed back. Something's happening. Something's happening. So if we go back 500 years, we look at the Great Reformation. And you look at the antecedents to that in the 200 or 300 years before that. Wycliffe and whatever, those people. Now we go back another 500 years from that, it's about 1000 AD, and we look at the great schism between, and again, this is a Christian piece, between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. All right? We should all be one, but you get different viewpoints. And then we go back, and she kind of works hard on this one. She calls it Gregory the Great, the Pope, who was truly the Pope who was great. We Anglican inheritors, we like the fact that he sent Augustine to England and helped set things in motion for us to be here in our building. But that's a lecture for another day. The thing about Gregory the Great's era is the fact that it's also the same time that Saint Benedict, the rule of Benedict, starts to emerge. Pious people have gone off to the desert to pray. This is part of all traditions. And these groups would come back in a Christian sense, and they would gather together and eventually form what were called monasteries. And they would be organized poorly or better or worse. The most brilliant organizer was Benedict of Nursia in Italy. And he also wrote an amazing rule. A rule for living in community, that if the basic precepts of the rule became part of our norm today, it would be very much in keeping with George Washington's 110 rules of civility that would move us simply from the ideals of chivalry and politeness into what it means to deeply listen and care for one another. The ideals that I heard him say in his Thanksgiving proclamation, his hopes and dreams for this nascent nation. Okay? Now, I have a little resource in front of me. I'm not selling the book, although you can buy it for $9 on Amazon or from Cokesbury.com or wherever you can find it. It is by a layperson, an Episcopalian, a lawyer though, okay, so you balance the act. His name is John McQuiston II. About 18 years ago, he found his life kind of out of control. And he was finding his way into this rule of Saint Benedict and discovering why this rule could help him sort out the busyness, the craziness of his life and this world. And then he felt called to give us all a great gift. He decided to rewrite the rule in modern day language, in language that anyone could read and bring in their own sense of whatever the greater is. We call love, eternal, God, fill in the blank names. Okay? So in this little book, it's not a beat you over the head tract. It's an incredibly deep piece of meditation that if you start reading it, you read it over and over again. And I fell in love with the first edition. And I have given out maybe 1,600 copies of this to people over the last 10 years. I think it's that important. And the rule begins with this. Attend to these instructions, listen with the heart and the mind. They are provided in a spirit of goodwill. The first rule is simply this. Now, this is what he wrote originally. Live this life and do whatever is done in a spirit of thanksgiving. Wow. I took that immediately to the stewardship bank and started telling everybody, in a spirit of thanksgiving, you can give to the church because this is what the first rule says. You see, I kind of manipulated it. There's three precepts that follow this. There are three precepts. Basically, one is called stability, one is called obedience, and one is called conversatio morum, or more easily understood as stability as sticking with it. In our fragile ADD society, sticking with it would be a good thing. Obedience has its root in the word obediere. One who hears or listens is one who is obedient. To be obedient to that which is greater than ourselves, fill in the blank name, is to listen. Sometimes listening is hard. Listening to God and one another, because who does God speak to us through at times? Not just through a burning bush. Got other places where God speaks. And then conversatio morum means daily improvement. Can you get better at this through a discipline of listening? Can you see how these precepts transcend all of us? It's just not one group or another. This is making it possible for us to live this life in a spirit of thanksgiving. And then he decided, out of his great humility, which, by the way, is the greatest part of the precepts, and there are so many definitions of humility, we don't have time for them tonight. And if I prove to you how humble I am, hey, I wore my doctor's hood. I blew that when I put that on, okay? All right, so Phyllis Tickle, remember her? She wrote the intro to the new edition. Maybe she had some influence on him. She said, I want you to rethink one of your lines. And it drove me crazy when I first saw it, because I had kind of gotten to my comfort place. You know, spirit of thanksgiving is I want the same meal every year. Who put this? What happened to the onions? Or, you know, when the meal changes. Well, a little change is good. Good change. This is what he rewrote it as. The first rule is simply this: live this life and do whatever is done in a spirit of loving kindness. What a bigger challenge. A spirit of loving kindness. Maybe George Washington boiled down, the great teacher that I follow, and of course, if I go farther than that, then I'm stepping out of bounds into my comfort language, okay? If you take a look at the Hebrew Scriptures as I have received them, always have to be careful when the rabbi is here. Micah 6:8. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. You have been invited tonight by the greater, the one that's love, give it the name, to be here tonight. Not to witness, hey, a great combined choir, thank you so much. Or all of us dressed and doing our thing. You have been invited by that greater to take a look at yourself and understand what it is to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. What is it to do that in a spirit of deep thanksgiving? What is it to understand oneself as flawed and in need of love, and looking at others flawed and in need of love, and realizing that we belong to one another? Together with that greater's, name it, help, we can make one another stronger. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to take into the world in the year 2017? Isn't that something that's desperately needed? Isn't that the gift that we have been given as inheritors of this noble American experiment? And as inheritors of it, we must see it preserved. So I go back and George Washington, constitutional law, First Amendment, love your neighbor as yourself. Do it. I almost said, well, I will. Illegitimi non carborundum. The Latin scholars would go, don't let the get you down. Trish knew. And in that spirit, however, the strength that we have, maybe with a discipline rule that we all share, I envision us someday sitting down and talking about this as a group and seeing how there's a commonality to these principles, sticking with it, listening carefully to God and one another, and daily improvement. My hope is that that is a message that is right for this Thanksgiving. Thank you for letting me speak.